Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum, and welcome to another edition of Debunked here on INX Prime. My name is Sulaimaan Ravat. The issue of Palestine continues to be of importance and of concern, even though Trump is telling everyone the war is over. He's applauding himself, patting himself on the back, and getting clapped and applauded by those who are his political allies, or those who are his political subordinates, if you want to call it that, or politically dependent on him for securing this big deal. Those who understand the realities know it's more of a pause than actual peace. And that as bad as the last 2 years have been for the people of Gaza, you cannot ignore that this is an 8-decade issue of illegal occupation, oppression. Yes, we've seen an escalation in the last 2 years that perhaps is unprecedented in our lifetime. Also, there are various aspects in terms of whether it will actually hold, whether Israel will look at some other pretext to start attacks again with the blessings of Donald Trump, whether the ultra-right wing, as they call them, within Netanyahu's alliance would put pressure on him and he'd capitulate to that pressure to keep himself away from those charges that hover over his head. The issue of aid is central, right? There's an absolute desperation for adequate aid to be able to come through. The aspect of Palestinian sovereignty that remains unresolved, and what role the Palestinians themselves will play in terms of determining their own future. So there are various aspects regarding the Palestinian issue that continue to remain relevant. Joining us for the discussion today, we have Reverend Ntlha, the General Secretary of the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa, and we'll be talking about their position in regards to Palestine in specific and issues of oppression and occupation in general. Reverend, a very good day to you and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on this debate. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to discuss this topic with you.
Let me start off by asking you to comment on some of what I've just mentioned in my introduction. What are your thoughts on what has happened in recent days, the ceasefire, this peace deal as Trump has called it, and what has unfolded subsequent to that?
Well, the way we see it is like this. If you continually hammer somebody for 2 years, bomb them, starve them, deny them of water, deny them of medical attention, and when they are virtually on their knees, you ask them to sign on the dotted line for a peace deal. It's quite clear that the peace deal is completely in the terms dictated by the bomber. It is dictated by the oppressor. It is dictated by Donald Trump with his ally in Israel, Netanyahu. So when you read the terms of the peace deal, it's quite clear that it was almost crafted with Israel more in mind than with the Hamas and with the people of Gaza. And so for that reason, it is not very different from 1948 when the Nakba happened, where the state of Israel was created not with consultation from the people who stayed in the land, Palestinian people. It was imposed on them by the superpower then was the British, and between the British and those who were the creators of the state of Israel, they agreed to create this state and bombed their way into it. And so that's how we have the current reality. And so it isn't much different than from this 2-year bombing and then saying, let's have peace. The peace is in accepting your subjugation, disarm, and we don't disarm, you disarm. And so it's like it's an imposition, put it that way.
We know there's a lot of focus on the Jewish community in Palestine. There's an obvious focus on the Muslim community in Palestine. What about the Christian community in Palestine, in the region? What are their sentiments? What are their conditions? What are their thoughts as you understand
it? We are in contact with the Kairos Palestine, which is a civil society network of Christian Palestinians. And they're quite clear that the terms of peace as it is prescribed now does not take into account the very basis for the revolt that preceded it and the revolt that has been simmering over the last 70 odd years. For them, there is no promise of a better future for them. There is no promise of the sovereignty of Palestine. There is no sense in which, there is Israel concedes to the legitimate aspirations of Palestinian people. And so in that sense, it's a different phase of struggle for them.
What's the approach been like from Christians globally? Because we know that the protest and the activism has not only come from Muslims, it's come from various faith groups, it's come from various ethnic groups, various nationalities in terms of the outrage that has been expressed and the activism that we've seen in the last 2 years. Basically, I'm asking you to give us some sort of an insider perspective in terms of how this played out within the Christian community.
The issue of Zionism, right from the beginning, Sulaiman, has been the creation of the Christian West, put it that way. Long before Jewish Zionists caught on to the idea, it was supported by Christian fundamentalists who believed that the return of Jesus Christ requires Israel to occupy the land, and so you have a combination of Zionist nationalist tendencies, as well as Christians who believe the return of Jesus Christ requires this kind of arrangement. And so it has been, in a sense, very easy to mobilize large chunks of the so-called Christian West. And I think it's important to bear in mind that what we call the Christian civilization and the Christian West generally, or Europe and North America, all of these powers are historically colonial powers. They cut up the African continent in the 1800s and shared it among themselves as colonies. So when they supported Zionism in the 1800s, they were colonial. They had a colonial mindset. In their view, there was nothing wrong with colonizing Palestine. And so when they needed to create a state for Israel, they were doing so with a colonial mindset. And so that is the DNA, if you like, of the Christian civilization that colonized Africa and that went to the US, colonized American Indians who were there. So the basic idea is a very racist, white supremacist, colonial mindset. And so the only hope is that those of us who are like South Africa, for example, who have a history of looking at the way in which Christianity was co-opted as a cover-up for colonialism, not only in South Africa, but across the world. In South Africa, there has been a struggle that your viewers might know how prominent churchmen and women were in the struggle for liberation here, like Desmond Tutu, Alan Busak, and others. In fact, the liberation movement as a whole was very much it had a lot of Christians' involvement in it. The first president of the African National Congress was a reverend, and the ANC was launched in a church in 1912. So all of that talks to the connection of Christians with the liberation movement. And so for the first time, if you like, in history, the microphone goes to the former colonial victims, such as South Africa. It is up to South Africa, for example, to take Israel to court when nobody else dares to do that. And that's because our reading of history, our reading of what's happening now, what happened in the past, what was happening in the future, depends on a transformation of the power arrangements in the world. And so in that sense, we believe that the more of the people on this continent, for example, who are themselves victims of colonialism and have all been part of liberation struggles, that one hopes that the Western propaganda that connects Jesus to the colonial project in Israel, Palestine, that they will be able to see the separation between those two. In South Africa, certainly there was no problem separating apartheid from our own faith, and in that way liberating both white oppressors who believed in apartheid and ourselves. And there are many white Afrikaners who were thankful for the fact that they were set free from their blind spots by their own victims.
So there has been a concern about the growth of Zionism in Africa. And many have said that on the one hand, money is being used, but on the other hand, religion is being used. You spoke early on about fundamentalist, Christian fundamentalist, interpreting scripture in a way that would suggest that it aligns with what Zionism stands for. We've seen here in South Africa politicians like Gayton McKenzie and others make reference to suggest that Christians should support Zionism. What's your analysis of this threat in Africa, where Christian theology can be used to promote Zionism?
Yeah, unfortunately that's the case, but not only theology. If you look at the tendencies in this country, where there is also a resurgence of Christian Zionists, a lot of money changes hands. A lot of the outspoken men and women who are Christian Zionists, often it starts this way. The leader of a local church, a pastor, is invited to go to Israel, is given a one-sided view of the story of Israel-Palestine, and they become forever committed to the cause of Israel. And so they come back in the country, and their entire congregations is mobilized similarly into that paradigm. I have my own personal story is that the first time I went to Israel, it was at the invitation of the Jewish community. I, at that time, went because I wanted to understand the bit of the history of the Christian story. It's because the Christian story starts in Jerusalem and in Bethlehem, actually. So when I went there, I realized actually that there were serious questions here that, for my South African mind, I needed answers. And fortunately, I visited Palestine 2 years later and got the other side of that story. Now, not many are as fortunate as myself to see both sides of the story. So a lot of them just hear one side and they run with it, and they believe that God requires them to be pro-Israel. And it's a misreading of theology, but there's also a lot of financial gains with regard to that. I was talking to somebody who used to be a very outspoken Christian Zionist, who said to me, how it normally happens is that you have somebody who works for a Jewish family as a domestic worker, and that Jewish family begins to almost brainwash this person and to get them to embrace the Jewish narrative. And pretty soon it becomes a connecting point with the black community. And in that way, a whole mobilization happens. So there's financial as well as misuse of the biblical material to support and entrench this Christian Zionism, which for mainstream Christianity, we consider it as a false doctrine, but it spreads like wildfire.
So, looking ahead, right, I mentioned in my introduction that we shouldn't only focus on the last 2 years. We can't lose sight of the fact that this is going on for the better part of 8 decades, this illegal occupation and oppression. Although the last 2 years have seen unprecedented levels of oppression. What, in your opinion, are the practical steps now from advocacy to humanitarian support that we need to be taking now to aid and support the Palestinian cause?
I think two things. Obviously, the Palestinians are in a decisive disadvantage as a result of this, their loss in the war, the destruction of infrastructure, universities, schools, hospitals, and all of this. So there is need to reconstruct, to be involved in a reconstruction mode. The hope is that the nations of the world will do so, will rally around Palestinian people to rebuild. But to the degree that we are under no illusions that this is peace. In fact, if you take the clock back to 7th October 2 years ago, conditions were pretty much what they will be after this peace deal. In fact, worse. And so the basic issues that were the reason for people revolting will still remain. And so our own story as South Africans is that there are very peaceful ways to end this occupation in Israel. And that peaceful strategy worked for us as South Africa. A BDS, which was the reason that the previous regime of apartheid was brought to its knees. And this is by the admission of those who were in the engine room of apartheid, some of its security apparatus, admit that whereas they could handle mass mobilization, they could handle armed struggle, they were a military superpower in the continent, what they couldn't handle was sanctions. And so that's what broke the back of apartheid in the end. And so I believe that we can do the same for people of Palestine and do sanctions against any business that entrench the occupation, that collaborate with the occupation, and that promotes the oppression of Palestinian people by Israel.
Finally, Reverend, in the broader sense, right, we hear many raising the concern about the rise of the so-called far right. We're seeing that even though we live in a so-called democratic age, what prevails ultimately is that might is right. The bigger boys will decide, and what they decide is what happens. We're also seeing a rise in materialism. And materialism then has its own set of consequences. When people are so materialistic, then human rights, justice, morality, all of that just becomes convenient. All of that is no longer paramount. How should people of faith then be looking at their activism and their approach in this kind of a climate globally, beyond just the Palestinian issue?
It's an important question. I mean, the whole point of religion, and I believe within other traditions is the same, even within the Jewish tradition, and I'm sure the Islamic one, there is an invitation for all of humanity to consider the higher ideals in life rather than to succumb to the basic instinct of the human nature. And so as far as the Christian tradition goes, we are disciples of Jesus, who died on the cross, crucified by the powerful nexus of allies in his context, in his day, the religious elites and the political elites conspiring to destroy his message. And so when you follow someone who died because he was upholding the values, I mean, his rallying point was he has come to bring good news to the poor. So when he was killed for that, it is pretty much like Steve Biko in this country, or Nelson Mandela, a lawyer who could have been a very wealthy man who minded his own business, didn't care about the next person, but he chose the way of suffering, and he became the global icon that we have today, that speaks with authority to everyone in the world. And so it shows us a reason for living, a better way to live, where you don't think only about yourself, but about the next person, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, and to love your creator with all that you have, mind, body, and soul. And so that is the only thing that will set us free from materialism and the greed and avarice that basically shapes our economies. We build our economies on those values that are anti-life, that are pro-death. So we don't do destruction to the planet by mistake. It is part of our policy framework. We intend to do it, and yet we hope for better results. So I think it's time to return to the basics of our faith and uphold life rather than death.
Reverend, thank you so much for your time and for chatting to us. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And have a great day.
For the time you've given us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was Reverend Mos Ntlha, General Secretary of the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa. We were talking to him about his perspective and his alliance's perspective, because there are those Christians who claim that no, Christian scripture supports Zionism, and he says it's clearly a false doctrine, and he was explaining that, and he was explaining why there are many Christians, some would say the majority, that support the Palestinian cause. And towards the end, I think a very important discussion that we need to have, that all major faith groups, we live in a climate of, I don't know what's the exact word that would best describe it, anti-faith. But even if it's not directly or aggressively anti-faith, it is indirectly anti-faith in terms of what is being promoted, the kind of hedonistic lifestyle that's being promoted. You must have your objectives, your goals, and you pursue it. The end justifies the means. That's where you find might is right. That's where you find people's lives are sacrificed for political gain. People's lives are sacrificed for monetary gain. People's lives are sacrificed for personal gain. Personal gain is given more prominence and more priority than collective good. And that's the kind of environment that we live in. We know that Islam came to abolish that kind of approach to life. That the collective is more important than the individual. Khayra ummah, you are the best of nations. The Quran tells us, ukhrijat linnas, you have been taken out to be of service to humanity. And when it comes to justice, then you serve the cause of justice not only when it's your own, not only when it's your own in terms of biological relationships, but also your own in terms of ideological or religious relationships. Justice must prevail for all, even those whom you dislike, even those of another belief structure, another faith group. And I think those are the kind of values that we need to reconnect with if, as a humanity, we can move forward in the direction of peace, justice, and prosperity. Otherwise, these kind of problems will continue to re-emerge in different shapes and forms because the fundamental issues have not been dealt with. That's it for this week's edition of Debunked. Until next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.